I needed to get away. Life in the city had become suffocating. Too many people, too much noise, too many problems I didn't want to deal with. A week of solitude in a remote cabin seemed like the perfect escape. I found a listing online for a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods, about an hour from the nearest town. It had no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and propane for cooking. A stream nearby provided fresh water. The pictures showed a rustic but well-maintained place, and the owner assured me it was safe and secluded. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my truck with supplies, non-perishable food, a couple of books, my hunting knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The drive took me farther and farther from civilization. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt. Trees closed in around me as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The cabin sat on a small clearing, perched on short stilts to keep it level on the uneven ground. It looked exactly like the pictures, simple, wooden, and inviting. A small porch wrapped around the front, with an old rocking chair facing the trees. The stream was visible just beyond the clearing, its soft gurgling adding to the peaceful atmosphere. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and breathed in the scent of aged wood and earth. It was a single-room cabin with a bed pushed against one wall, a small kitchenette, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a trapdoor in the floor for storage, which the owner had mentioned was mostly empty aside from a few spare tools. The silence was perfect. The first day was uneventful. I chopped some firewood, explored the nearby woods, and made a simple dinner. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit a fire in the stove and settled into the rocking chair with a book. Outside, the woods were alive with the sounds of nature, crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I was used to city noise, but this was different. Every sound felt sharper, more distinct. I went to bed early, exhausted from the long drive. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the warmth from the fire made the cabin feel safe and cozy. I drifted off easily. At some point in the night, I woke up. Something had disturbed me, but I wasn't sure what. I listened. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light across the walls. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like wood shifting under weight. I told myself it was nothing, the cabin settling or the wind outside, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I stayed awake for a while, listening, but heard nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining things and fell back asleep. The next morning was crisp and cold. I made coffee and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the fresh air. The woods were quiet, peaceful. Then I noticed something strange. A single empty food wrapper lay on the porch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It wasn't mine. I hadn't eaten anything in a wrapper since arriving. I frowned, looking around. Maybe an animal had gotten into something? But there was no sign of torn packaging in the cabin. I shook it off and went about my day. That evening, I made a simple dinner, canned soup and bread, and read by the fire again. The silence was heavier that night, the woods eerily still. I told myself I was just getting in my own head. Before bed, I double-checked the door lock, then slid the heavy wooden latch into place for extra security. The windows had thick shutters, which I also secured. Just as I was settling under the blankets, I heard something outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I held my breath, heart pounding. It was too steady to be an animal. Animals move in erratic bursts, quick steps, pauses, sniffing. This sounded like footsteps, someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it toward the window. Through the small cracks in the shutters, I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I listened for what felt like forever. No movement, no sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination and forced myself to sleep. I woke up feeling uneasy, like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I went to make breakfast, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The loaf of bread I had left on the counter was missing. I was sure I had left it there. I searched the small space, but it was nowhere to be found. I checked the door, still locked from the inside. The windows were shut and latched. There was no sign of forced entry. I told myself I must have put it somewhere without thinking, but the gnawing sense of unease stayed with me. That night, I locked everything again, wedging a chair under the doorknob for good measure. At some point in the early morning, I woke up. The fire had died down, and the room was nearly pitch black. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic breathing. Not mine, not close but not far either. It was coming from beneath the floor. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The breathing was slow and steady, like someone asleep. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The trapdoor, the storage space under the cabin. I had checked it when I first arrived. Nothing was down there except a few tools, but I hadn't checked it since. The breathing continued, slow, even. Someone was under the cabin. I moved as quietly as I could, reaching for my knife. My hands were shaking. I needed to get out, but I had to do it without making noise. The door was locked. The shutters were closed. If I moved too suddenly, whoever was under the cabin might hear me. I slid out of bed, moving painfully slow. The floor creaked beneath me. The breathing stopped. My heart nearly stopped with it. Then movement, a rustling sound, a shift of weight. Whoever was under there was awake. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the trapdoor. Silence. I took a deep breath, then yanked the door open and shined the light inside. The space was dark, just dirt and wooden beams. First, I saw nothing. Then, in the farthest corner, a shape shifted. A man, curled up in the dirt, his face turned away, his body thin and dirty. He was breathing heavily, like he had just woken up. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door, yanked the chair away, and unlocked it in one motion. As I threw it open, I heard scrambling behind me. He was moving. I ran. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling for the keys. Behind me, I heard the cabin door creak. He was coming out. I got the door open, jumped in, and locked it. My headlights illuminated the clearing, but I saw nothing. Then movement by the trees, a figure slipping into the darkness. I turned the engine over and peeled out of there, gravel flying. I drove straight to town, shaking the whole way. The next day, I told the cabin owner what happened. He didn't seem surprised. "Yeah," he said, "sometimes squatters find their way out there. Thought I got rid of the last one. I never went back." I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A weekend away from the city, away from the stress of work, the constant ringing of my phone, and the suffocating feeling of being surrounded by people all the time. My friend Aaron had found the cabin online, a remote place deep in the woods, advertised as the perfect getaway for those looking to unplug. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just nature and silence. It sounded perfect. The drive up took longer than expected. We had underestimated how deep into the forest the cabin was. The last hour of the drive was nothing but a narrow dirt road, winding through thick trees with barely enough room for the car to pass. The farther we drove, the darker the forest seemed to get, the trees pressing in on both sides like they were swallowing us whole. By the time we arrived, it was already dusk. The cabin was small but looked cozy. A simple wooden structure with a porch, a single chimney, and large windows facing the trees. The listing had described it as rustic with modern touches, and that seemed accurate. The exterior looked aged, but the inside was clean and well-furnished. The living room had a fireplace, a couch, and a small TV. The kitchen was stocked with basic supplies. There were 2 bedrooms, each with a single bed and a bathroom with an old-fashioned clawfoot tub. "Not bad," Aaron said, tossing his bag onto the couch. I nodded, setting mine down beside his. "Yeah, it's nice. Secluded." We unpacked, put away the groceries we had brought, and settled in for the night. Aaron started a fire in the fireplace while I cracked open a beer and leaned back on the couch, enjoying the quiet. It was peaceful. No traffic noise, no distant hum of the city, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of insects outside. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The first strange thing happened later that night. After a couple of beers, I got up to use the bathroom. As I washed my hands, I glanced up at the small mirror above the sink. Something caught my eye, a faint red light reflected in the glass. I turned around, scanning the room. The bathroom was small, with a single window covered by a thin curtain. The only visible electronics were a light fixture and an old vent near the ceiling. I stepped closer to the vent, squinting. There it was again. A tiny red light. It was gone a second later, as if it had never been there. I hesitated, debating whether to call Aaron over, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. It was probably just a reflection from something outside. The mind plays tricks in unfamiliar places. Shaking it off, I went back to the living room. Aaron was half asleep on the couch, the fire dying down to embers. "I'm turning in," I said. He grunted in response, eyes closed. I went to my room, locked the door, and crawled into bed. I told myself it was nothing, but something about that little red light stayed in my mind long after I closed my eyes. The next morning, I woke early. The air in the cabin was cold, the fireplace completely out. I pulled on a sweater and walked into the kitchen to make coffee. Aaron was still asleep, snoring lightly from his room. As I poured myself a cup, I found my eyes drifting toward the bathroom door. That red light, it had to have been my imagination, right? Before I could talk myself out of it, I set down my coffee and grabbed a chair, dragging it into the bathroom. Climbing up, I leaned close to the vent, inspecting it carefully. The slats were covered in dust, but as I peered inside, I felt my stomach tighten. There, hidden within the vent, was a tiny camera. A lens, barely visible, tucked behind the metal. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. A camera, watching us. I climbed down quickly, my hands shaking. I rushed to Aaron's room and shook his shoulder. "Dude, wake up," he groaned. "What?" I didn't say anything, just grabbed his arm and dragged him into the bathroom. Still half asleep, he blinked at me in confusion as I pointed at the vent. "Look inside," I said. He frowned but did as I said. The moment he saw it, his expression changed. "Is that?" "Yeah." A heavy silence fell between us. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Aaron exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, that's messed up. But maybe it could be old, right? Maybe someone installed it years ago and forgot about it." I shook my head. "It's on. I saw a red light last night." Aaron cursed under his breath. "That's not good." We searched the entire cabin. It didn't take long to find the second one, hidden inside the smoke detector in the living room. Then another in the bedroom, disguised as a small screw in the wooden headboard. There were cameras everywhere. In the bathroom, in the living room, in both bedrooms. Someone had been watching us. My stomach churned as I thought about it. Watching us eat, sleep, talk, watching me in the bathroom. Aaron turned to me, his face pale. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, grabbing my phone. "No signal." "We'll drive to town," I said. "Find the cops. Let them handle it." Aaron didn't argue. We grabbed our bags, threw everything in the trunk, and locked the cabin behind us. We had just reached the end of the dirt road when headlights appeared up ahead. Car was coming. A black pickup truck moving slow. stopped directly in front of us, blocking the road. A man stepped out, tall, heavy-set, wearing a flannel jacket and boots. He looked like he belonged in the woods, like he knew them better than we did. He stared at us for a long moment, then smiled. "You boys leaving already?" Something in his tone made my skin crawl. "Yeah," Aaron said, forcing a casual tone. "Change of plans." The man's smile didn't fade. He glanced toward the cabin, then back at us. His eyes lingered on the trunk of our car. "Find something interesting in there?" Neither of us spoke. His smile widened, but his eyes were cold. "Hope you boys enjoyed your stay." We said nothing. Slowly, he stepped back into his truck, but he didn't move. He just sat there, engine idling, watching us. Aaron gripped the wheel. "Drive." I didn't have to tell him twice. He hit the gas, swerving around the truck. The man didn't follow, but as we drove away, I glanced in the side mirror. He was still sitting there, watching us, smiling. We went straight to the police. They took our statement, sent a deputy to check the cabin. But by the time they arrived, the cameras were gone. The vents were empty. The smoke detector was a normal smoke detector. The place was spotless. No evidence, no proof. The rental listing was deleted the next day. The owner's contact information vanished. It was like the cabin never existed. But I know what we saw. I still see that smile in my nightmares. I had always been comfortable alone in the wilderness. There was something about the quiet, the stillness, and the distance from the rest of the world that brought me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. That's why, when I had a long weekend off work, I decided to hike up to a remote cabin in the mountains. It wasn't the kind of place you rented off a website or found in a travel guide. It belonged to a distant family friend, and it was well off any main trails. No roads led to it. You had to hike in about 8 miles through dense forest to reach it. That was exactly what I wanted. Absolute solitude. I packed light but smart freeze-dried meals, a sturdy knife, a hatchet, a sleeping bag, and a few other essentials. The cabin had a water source nearby, a small wood stove, and enough firewood stacked outside to last a winter. I wasn't worried about comfort. The hike up was beautiful. It was late autumn, the trees were mostly bare, and the air had that crisp bite to it. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I made good time, reaching the cabin in the late afternoon. It was exactly as I remembered. Small, sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a sloped roof designed to handle heavy snowfall. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, the hinges stiff from lack of use. Inside, everything was as it should be: simple furniture, a cast iron stove, a rough wooden table, and a single cot against the wall. I spent the evening settling in, chopping a bit of extra firewood, and watching the sky darken through the small window. By the time night fully fell, I had a fire going inside, and I sat on the cot, listening to the absolute silence of the wilderness. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it as an animal. A soft crunch of footsteps outside. Not close, but not far either. A slow, deliberate movement through the leaves. I had seen deer on my way up, and the occasional black bear wasn't uncommon in this area. I figured it was one of them. I wasn't worried. I had a knife at my side and an axe by the door, and I knew how to handle myself. Still, I found myself listening more intently as I lay back in my cot, the fire casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. I stayed awake longer than I meant to, my mind straining to pick out any more sounds. But there was nothing after that. Only the wind, the creaking trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. In the morning, I found footprints. Not animal tracks, human. I stood in the cold dawn air, staring at them in the soft dirt near the trees. They weren't mine. I had taken a different path around the back of the cabin when I arrived. These tracks had come from the opposite direction, circling toward the front, stopping a few feet from the porch. They weren't fresh, maybe a day old, maybe less. The edges had softened slightly from the night air, but they were clear. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old hunter, maybe another hiker who had wandered through. But deep down, I knew how unlikely that was. This place wasn't on any map. You had to know it was here. Still, I didn't let it bother me too much. I spent the day exploring a bit, checking out the small stream a quarter-mile downhill where I collected water. I hunted some rabbits, cooked one over the fire, and enjoyed the quiet. But as the sun set and the shadows stretched longer, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The second night, I heard them again. Footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate, not crashing through the underbrush like an animal, not the random sounds of nature shifting in the night. These were precise, moving in measured steps just beyond the tree line. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, gripping my knife. The fire had burned low, casting only faint light. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps stopped. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, just barely audible, I heard breathing. Not mine. Not close, but not far. I didn't move for what felt like hours, every muscle tense. Eventually, the sounds faded. No footsteps moving away, just gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe the wind. Maybe my own mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. Then I saw the footprints. New ones. Closer to the cabin this time. They led around the side, stopping near the back window. Someone had been standing there, watching. I checked the door, still locked from the inside. The windows still latched. Nothing had been disturbed, but the footprints were proof enough. Someone was out here, watching me. I debated hiking out immediately, but it was a long way back to my car, and I didn't want to be caught in the open if I was being followed. Instead, I spent the day making preparations. I gathered wood, brought water inside, checked my weapons. I made sure everything was within reach. Then I waited. That night, I left the fire burning low and stayed awake, knife in hand. I sat in the darkness, barely breathing, listening. It was past midnight when I heard it. A soft creak of wood. Not inside, outside. On the porch. I gripped the knife tighter, my pulse hammering. Then slowly the doorknob turned. I shot up, heart slamming against my ribs. The door was locked. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Minutes passed. Then soft footsteps moving away. I stayed awake until dawn. When I finally dared to open the door, the only sign that someone had been there was a single muddy handprint on the wood. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, my knife, and my axe, and I started hiking out as soon as the sun was up. I moved fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The trail felt different now. No longer peaceful, just exposed. 3 miles in, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A fresh set of footprints.
Matking mine.
Following mine. I wasn't alone on the trail. I didn't run. Running meant noise. Instead, I kept moving, kept my pace steady, knife in hand. Then, ahead of me on the path, something was tied to a low-hanging branch. A rabbit, strung up by its legs. His throat slit. Fresh blood dripped onto the leaves below. A message. I forced myself to keep walking. The last 2 miles felt like a lifetime, but finally, I saw my car through the trees. I ran, threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror. At the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure, watching me leave. I never went back. My brother Jake and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months. We both needed the break. He from his soul-sucking job in the city, me from the endless stress of my final year in college. A remote cabin in the mountains sounded like the perfect escape. We found a listing online, a small rustic place deep in the woods. No neighbors, no cell service, no distractions. The drive was long, winding through thick forests and narrow dirt roads. By the time we arrived, the sun had already set, casting the landscape in deep shadows. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, an old wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a single light above the door. It looked exactly like the photos, cozy, isolated, perfect. Jake grabbed the keys from under the porch mat, just as the owner had instructed. They slid into the lock smoothly, and the door creaked open into a warm, musty interior. The cabin smelled of old wood and damp air, like it hadn't been used in a while. It was small but functional. One main room with a fireplace, a couch, and a tiny kitchen. A narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Jake dumped his bag on the couch and stretched. "Man, this place is perfect," he said. "No emails, no calls, no people." I nodded, though something felt slightly off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air inside seemed different, lived in. I pushed the thought aside. It was probably just my mind adjusting to the silence after the long drive. We made a quick dinner, ate by the dim glow of a lantern, and called it an early night. As I climbed into bed, I told myself that tomorrow would be the relaxing escape we'd been hoping for. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The cabin was silent, the only sound my own breathing. But as I lay there, listening, a faint noise reached my ears, a soft creaking, like weight shifting on old wooden planks. I held my breath. The sound came again, from the living room, a slow, deliberate step. For a long time, I lay still, waiting, but nothing followed. The air was heavy with silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been the wind or the cabin settling. I forced my eyes shut and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Jake was already up, brewing coffee in the tiny kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the previous night's unease feel ridiculous. "You hear anything weird last night?" I asked, pouring myself a cup. "Nah," he said. "Slept like a rock." I let it go. Maybe I had imagined it. We spent the day hiking through the woods, fishing in the nearby stream, enjoying the quiet. By the time we returned, we were exhausted. The sun was already dipping behind the trees as we made dinner, laughing and talking like we hadn't in months. Then Jake went to grab a beer from the fridge and froze. "Dude," he said slowly, "did you drink one of these already?" I looked up.
No.
"Why?" He held up a beer bottle. The cap was off, the liquid inside half gone. We stared at each other. Neither of us had touched the beer since arriving. A chill ran down my spine. "Maybe it was the owner?" I suggested weakly. "Maybe he left one open by accident?" Jake didn't look convinced. "Let's check the doors." We made a round of the cabin. The front door was still locked. So were the windows. There was no sign of forced entry. Still, the uneasy feeling from the night before returned, creeping under my skin. Jake sighed. "Probably just some weird mistake. Let's not freak ourselves out." I nodded, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The third day, things got worse. Started small. Jake's shoes were wet when he woke up, despite being inside all night. My toothbrush, which I had left on the sink, was gone. A single chair in the living room had moved, angled toward the hallway like someone had been sitting in it, watching. We tried to laugh it off, but by afternoon, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The walls felt too close, the silence too heavy. By evening, neither of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we ate dinner, Jake's eyes flicked toward the hallway. "I swear to God, man," he muttered. "I keep thinking I'm seeing something move out of the corner of my eye." I swallowed hard. Same. The sun set. Darkness filled the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. 2 a.m., the sound came again. A slow, deliberate creak from the living room. Then another. Closer. Jake and I sat up at the same time. We didn't speak, barely breathed. A third step. Jake reached under his bed and pulled out a hunting knife. I grabbed my flashlight. We moved together, slow and silent, stepping into the hallway. The living room was pitch black. I flicked on the flashlight. The beam landed on the couch, the kitchen, the chair. Nothing. Then I saw it. A single muddy footprint on the wooden floor. A fresh one. My chest tightened. Jake's grip on the knife tightened. He turned to me, eyes wide. "We're not alone." Then something crashed behind us. We spun around. The noise had come from the bedroom, my bedroom. My skin crawled. We had just been in there. Jake stepped forward, knife raised. I followed, my heart hammering. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was empty, except for one thing. The closet door was open, and inside, in the shadows, a crumpled blanket, an empty water bottle, and a pair of dirty boots sat tucked behind the hanging clothes. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "Someone's been living here." A sound came from the hallway, a breath, a footstep. We weren't alone. Jake grabbed my arm. "Run." We sprinted out of the room, down the hallway, toward the front door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock. Behind us, the floor creaked. Someone was moving. Fast. I yanked the door open. We bolted onto the porch and into the night. Branches whipped against my face as we ran. Neither of us looked back. Took us over an hour to reach the car. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. We called the cabin owner the next morning. He sounded confused. "I haven't rented that place out in months," he said. "You guys were the first ones since winter." I swallowed. "Are you sure?" He hesitated. "Wait, you used the key under the mat?" "Yes." A long silence. "I never put a key under the mat," he said finally. "Someone else must have." A cold chill ran down my spine. We hung up without another word. Jake and I never spoke about it again. But sometimes I still wonder who had been living in that cabin. How long had they been there? And what would have happened if we had stayed one more night? The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. My girlfriend, Amy, and I had planned this trip for months. A weekend in the mountains, away from work, phone calls, and the noise of everyday life. We had booked a small but cozy rental deep in the woods, a place with no cell service and miles of forest in every direction. By the time we turned onto the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin, it was already past 11 p.m. The sky was pitch black, and the headlights illuminated only what was directly in front of us. Dense trees, thick underbrush, and the rough road that twisted through the woods. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Amy asked, her voice edged with concern. I checked the GPS on my phone before we lost signal. "Yeah, the listing said it's remote. We're supposed to take this road for 2 miles, and then the cabin will be on the left." The road narrowed further, barely wide enough for the car. Tree branches scraped the sides as we drove deeper into the woods. The air felt colder, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our tires. After what felt like an eternity, we spotted a cabin in the clearing ahead. It looked exactly like the photos from the listing. A small wooden structure with a porch, a stone chimney, and a single dim porch light glowing in the darkness. "There it is," I said, relieved. Amy exhaled. "Finally." We pulled into the clearing, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The cabin sat alone in the dense forest. No other houses or signs of life nearby, just the way we wanted it. I parked the car, grabbed the small printed confirmation email from my bag, and double-checked the instructions. The key was supposed to be hidden under a loose stone beside the steps. I stepped out of the car into the crisp night air. The forest was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just stillness. I walked up the porch steps, reached down, and found the loose stone exactly where the instructions said it would be. Underneath was a key. "Got it," I called out. Amy was already pulling our bags from the car. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The scent of old wood and fireplace ash greeted me. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. Dim yellow light filled the small living room. Simple furniture, a couch, a coffee table, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. Amy came in behind me, setting our bags down. "It's cute," she said, looking around. "Kind of cozy." I smiled. "Yeah, exactly what we needed." The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was warm, private, and inviting. There was a small kitchen, a bedroom with a queen-sized bed, and a bathroom with an old clawfoot tub. Everything was as expected. We were exhausted from the long drive, so we decided to skip unpacking and head straight to bed. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the smell. An odd, slightly damp odor, like wet wood or old fabric. I blinked in the dim morning light filtering through the curtains. Amy stirred beside me. "What time is it?" she murmured. I checked my watch. A little after 8. We got up, stretching off the stiffness from the drive. Amy went to make coffee while I wandered into the small bathroom. That's when I noticed something strange. A towel hung on the rack. Not a folded, fresh towel, one that had been used recently. It was slightly damp. I frowned. The listing said no one had stayed here for at least a week before our visit. Maybe the cleaning service had left it behind. Shrugging it off, I went back to the kitchen. Amy had poured 2 mugs of coffee and was staring at the counter. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed at the sink. "Was this here last night?" In the sink sat a single dirty coffee mug. Dried residue clung to the inside. A strange unease settled over me. "Maybe the cleaner forgot to wash it," I suggested, but even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. Amy didn't respond, but I could tell she was unsettled too. We ate a quick breakfast and decided to go for a morning hike, trying to shake off the weird feeling. The hike was peaceful but uneventful. We followed a trail that looped around a nearby stream, the sound of running water breaking the eerie silence of the woods. By the time we returned, the sun was high, casting long shadows across the clearing. As we approached the cabin, Amy suddenly grabbed my arm. "Wait!" I stopped. "What?" She pointed at the ground near the porch steps. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the edge of the trees to the front door. Amy's face paled. "Those weren't there when we left." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Someone had been here. I hurried up the steps and pushed the door open. Everything inside looked the same at first glance. But as I stepped further in, something caught my eye. The coffee mug. It was gone. Amy followed me in. "Did you move it?" she asked, her voice shaky. "No," I said, barely above a whisper. We stood frozen, listening for any sounds inside the cabin. Nothing, just silence. "Maybe we should go," Amy said. I hesitated. "Let's check the place first." We moved cautiously, checking the bedroom, the bathroom, the tiny storage closet. Nothing seemed out of place except for the missing mug. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe we had just overlooked something. Maybe the cleaning service had come back to finish up. Amy wasn't convinced. "I don't feel safe here." I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the same creeping unease. "We'll leave first thing in the morning. It's already late, and I don't want to drive these roads at night." Reluctantly, she agreed. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every rustling sound outside had me on edge. 3 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped near the door. Then, the doorknob turned. Amy stirred beside me. "What was that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I grabbed my phone, even though I knew we had no signal. Then, a voice, deep, angry. "What the hell are you doing in my cabin?" My blood ran cold. I jumped out of bed, yanked the door open, and came face to face with a man. Middle-aged, rugged, dressed in worn clothes. His eyes were furious. "This is a rental," I stammered. "We booked it online." The man glared at me, then at Amy, who was peeking from behind me. "This ain't a rental," he snapped. "This is my damn house." The realization hit me like a punch. We were in the wrong cabin. Amy gasped. "Oh my God." The man stepped back, shaking his head. "Get out. Now." We didn't argue. We grabbed our bags, barely stopping to zip them, and bolted for the car. As we sped away, my mind raced. How had we gotten in? Where was the real rental? And more terrifyingly, if this was his cabin, who had been inside with us? It was early September when I decided to take a solo camping trip to the mountains. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work, and a weekend in nature seemed like the perfect reset. The place I chose was remote, miles away from the nearest town, deep in the woods. There was an old cabin near the lake, but I wasn't staying there. My plan was to pitch my tent by the water and enjoy a quiet few days of fishing, hiking, and solitude. The drive up was rough, full of winding dirt roads and potholes. By the time I arrived, the sun was already beginning to set. The lake was stunning, calm, glassy water reflecting the towering pines. The cabin sat about 50 yards away from the shoreline, a small rustic structure with faded wooden walls and a sagging roof. It looked abandoned, but I had read that it was occasionally rented out to hikers. I parked my truck and got to work setting up my tent. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed movement near the cabin. A woman was standing on the porch, watching me. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long brown hair and a slender frame. She wore jeans and a gray hoodie, her hands tucked into the pockets. When she realized I had seen her, she gave a small wave. Not wanting to be rude, I waved back. "Hey," she called out. Her voice was soft but carried through the stillness. "Hey," I replied, walking a few steps closer. "Didn't expect to have a neighbor out here." She smiled, but it was brief. "Yeah, same." There was something in her expression, something uneasy. I didn't push for conversation, but I figured it was best to be friendly. "I'm just here for a couple of nights, camping by the lake." She nodded. "Me too. Well, not camping, just staying in the cabin." We stood there for a few seconds in awkward silence. She seemed hesitant, glancing toward the trees as if expecting someone to appear. "You okay?" I asked. Her lips parted slightly like she was about to say something, but she hesitated. Then she just nodded. "Yeah, just be careful out here." That was an odd thing to say. "Of what?" She gave a small shrug. "You know, just nature, weather, stuff like that." Before I could ask more, she turned and disappeared into the cabin, closing the door behind her. I finished setting up my tent and got a fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The lake was eerily still, reflecting the full moon. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I thought about the girl in the cabin. There was something strange about our interaction. She seemed nervous, or maybe she just wasn't used to being alone out here. Either way, I let it go. It wasn't my business. I ate a quick meal, then sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the quiet. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. As I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling near the cabin. I held my breath, listening. It was quiet for a moment, then another sound, like soft footsteps on wood. I unzipped my tent slightly, peeking out. The cabin's front porch light was off, but the faint glow of a candle flickered behind the window. I told myself it was just the girl moving around inside, but something about it unsettled me. I laid back down, forcing myself to ignore it. Sometime during the night, I woke to a sound that made my stomach drop. A muffled cry. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, coming from the direction of the cabin. I sat up, fully awake now. My tent was zipped up tight, and outside, the fire had died down to embers. The night was silent again, except for the occasional chirp of crickets. I listened, heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then, a low thud, followed by another, then silence. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated. If something was happening in that cabin, did I really want to get involved? But if someone was in trouble, taking a deep breath, I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and stepped out. The cold air sent a chill through my body. I aimed the flashlight at the cabin. The window was dark now. I took a step forward, then another. I was halfway to the cabin when I noticed something on the ground. A single shoe, small like it belonged to a woman. I moved my flashlight around, scanning the area. That's when I saw the footprints, bare footprints leading away from the cabin, into the woods. I swallowed hard. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I wanted to follow the tracks, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I slowly backed away, returning to my tent. I zipped it up and gripped the flashlight tightly, listening for any sound. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and with it, an eerie silence. The lake was still. The wind barely stirred the trees. I stepped out of my tent, stretching my stiff limbs. The footprints leading into the woods were still there, but they ended abruptly about 20 feet in, as if the person had just vanished. I turned toward the cabin. The front door was slightly ajar. A lump formed in my throat. Had the girl left? Did she run off into the woods in the middle of the night? I approached cautiously, pushing the door open with one hand. Inside, the cabin was bare.
No bags. No supplies.
No sign that anyone had ever been there. I checked the bathroom, the small kitchen, nothing. Then I saw it. On the wooden table, a single sheet of paper. A note. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The handwriting was messy, hurried. "If you see this, please leave. I thought I was alone here, but I'm not. They don't like visitors. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have come. If you hear anything tonight, don't open your tent. Don't look outside. Just leave in the morning."
No signature.
The air felt suddenly heavy, like the walls of the cabin were closing in on me. My mind raced. Who was she running from? Who or what had been out there with us? I ran back to my tent, stuffing everything into my backpack as quickly as I could. I didn't care about packing neatly. I just needed to get out of there. I loaded my truck and took one last look at the cabin. The porch creaked slightly in the breeze. The place felt wrong. I drove away, the dirt road winding through the trees. It was only when I reached the main road that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. Later, when I told a park ranger about the girl, he frowned. "No one's rented that cabin in months," he said. "It's been empty." I didn't argue. I just nodded and left. I'll never know what really happened that night. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that muffled cry, and I wonder if I should have knocked on that door sooner. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin alone. It was my grandfather's hunting retreat, deep in the forest, miles from anything resembling civilization. I had been there a few times as a kid, always with family, always in the summer. But this time was different. I was alone, and it was the dead of winter. The plan was simple: spend a week away from everything, clear my head, and maybe get a little hunting done. I had brought enough supplies to last me through the trip: canned food, bottled water, firewood, extra blankets. The place was old, but solid, built decades ago by my grandfather and his brothers. It had no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove for heat and an outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. The first day passed without incident. I arrived early in the afternoon, chopped some wood, and got a fire going inside. The cabin had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old couch and a rocking chair that creaked every time the wind shook the walls. There was a loft above the main room, but it had always been used for storage. As far as I knew, no one had slept up there in years. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the first sound, a faint scratching coming from the walls. At first, I didn't think much of it. The cabin was old. Mice were a possibility. Maybe squirrels had found a way in. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and forced myself to ignore it. It was just the kind of noise an old cabin makes. But the next night, the scratching got louder. I had spent most of the day outside, setting up a few traps and checking the area for signs of deer. By the time I got back, it was almost dark, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the air inside was cold. I threw in some logs and sat by the heat, rubbing my hands together, listening to the quiet. That's when I heard it again. It wasn't just scratching. It was something deeper, a slow, dragging sound, like fingernails running along the inside of the walls. I froze. The noise seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin, near the bedroom. My first thought was that maybe an animal had gotten inside, something bigger than a mouse. A raccoon, maybe, or even a porcupine. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped toward the bedroom door. Silence. I waited, holding my breath, my heart pounding. Nothing. I exhaled and shook my head. My mind was playing tricks on me. Being out here alone was getting to me. I had grown up in the woods, spent my whole life hunting, fishing, camping. I wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily. But as I lay in bed that night, the sound returned. A slow, deliberate movement behind the walls, just inches from my head. I sat up and listened. It was steady, rhythmic. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I felt something then, something I hadn't felt in years. Fear. I grabbed my hunting knife from the bedside table and turned on my flashlight. The beam illuminated the wooden walls, rough and aged, the grain of the wood deep and uneven. There was no sign of movement, no gaps where an animal could have gotten in. I pressed my hand against the wall. The sound stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then 3 knocks, from inside the wall. I yanked my hand back as if the wood had burned me. My breath hitched in my throat. That wasn't an animal. Someone was in there. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed my rifle, and backed toward the door. My mind raced through the possibilities. The cabin had been locked up tight when I arrived. The only way in or out was through the front door or the small window in the kitchen. There was no basement, no crawl space, just the foundation sitting on concrete blocks. I stood there, gripping the rifle, waiting. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the wind had rattled something loose. Maybe the firewood had settled in the stove. I was exhausted, my nerves on edge. I needed sleep. I returned to bed but kept the rifle close. The scratching didn't come back that night. I woke early, my body stiff from the cold. The fire had burned down again, and I spent the morning chopping more wood, trying to keep my mind occupied. I told myself I wasn't scared. I was just being cautious. But the feeling stayed with me, that unsettling awareness that I wasn't alone. I checked the outside of the cabin, circling the perimeter, looking for any signs of forced entry. The snow around the foundation was untouched.
No footprints. No claw marks.
Nothing. Whatever had been making that noise, it hadn't come from outside. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was inside the walls. The first thing I did was move the old rocking chair away from the corner of the room. That's where the noise had been the loudest. I ran my hands along the wooden planks, searching for any gaps, any weak spots. The boards were old but solid. Then I saw it. A single, thin crack between two planks, just wide enough to slip a knife into. My pulse quickened. I wedged the tip of my hunting knife into the crack and pried gently. The wood groaned, resisting at first, then gave way with a sharp pop. A section of the wall swung outward. Behind it was darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it inside. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It wasn't insulation. It wasn't wiring. It was blankets, old, filthy blankets, packed into a tight space between the walls. And food wrappers, empty cans of beans, crumpled plastic. My stomach turned. Someone had been living in here. I shined the light deeper, my breath coming in short gasps. And that's when I saw the ladder. A small, wooden ladder leading down through a hole in the floorboards. I jerked back, my mind racing. There shouldn't have been anything beneath the cabin. It sat on a raised foundation, no basement, no crawl space. But there it was, a hidden space beneath my feet. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to move, to grab my rifle and aim it at the opening. I listened. Silence. Then, from below, a breath. Slow. Shallow. Someone was down there. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran out the front door, leaving everything else behind. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my breath clouding in the cold air. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, snow spraying up behind me. I drove straight to town, straight to the sheriff's office. I must have looked like a madman, covered in sweat despite the cold, my words coming out in a frantic rush. They didn't believe me at first, but they sent a deputy to check it out. When they returned, their faces were pale. They had found the hidden space beneath the cabin, but it was empty. Whoever had been living there, they were gone. The only thing they left behind was a single muddy handprint on the wooden ladder, and the scratching never stopped. The drive to the cabin was longer than expected, and by the time I reached the winding dirt road that led to it, the sun was already setting. I had rented this place for a full week, a solo retreat to clear my head, escape the noise of the city, and maybe finish the book I had been working on. The listing had advertised it as a remote, rustic cabin deep in the woods, perfect for solitude. The place was exactly as I had expected, small but cozy, with a wooden porch, a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom. The inside smelled of old wood and dust, like it hadn't been used in months. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell service. That was part of the appeal. A logbook sat on the coffee table, left for guests to write about their stays. I had seen these before in other rentals, people leaving behind little notes about how much they enjoyed the place, or sometimes small anecdotes about their trips. I flipped through a few pages as I settled in. Most entries were normal. Great weekend getaway. Loved the hiking trails. The lake is beautiful in the morning. We saw a family of deer near the cabin, but as I got to the more recent entries, the tone changed. I saw him watching from the trees. That was all it said. Nothing else, no name or date, just one line in shaky handwriting. I frowned but brushed it off. Someone trying to be funny, probably. I closed the book and set it aside, deciding to make some dinner before it got too dark. I woke up early and spent the morning hiking through the dense forest surrounding the cabin. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up immediately. I followed a narrow, overgrown path that led to a small, silent lake. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Back at the cabin, I made coffee and flipped through the logbook again, curiosity getting the better of me. He came closer last night. That was the next entry, the same handwriting as before. I closed the book and set it down. Maybe a previous guest was playing some kind of joke, trying to spook people who stayed here after them. But when I stepped outside onto the porch, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. The treads were different, larger, and they circled the cabin in the mud, as if someone had walked around the place multiple times. I stared at them for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe another hiker had passed through. Maybe it was the cabin's owner checking in. But why wouldn't they have knocked? I shook it off, convincing myself it wasn't worth worrying about. That night it rained, hard. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the roof like distant footsteps. I sat by the fireplace trying to read, but my mind kept going back to the logbook. I picked it up again and flipped to the most recent entry. If you're reading this, it's too late. A chill ran through me. The words were fresh, the ink slightly smudged as if someone had written them recently. I slammed the book shut, suddenly feeling foolish for staying here alone. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A knock, not at the door, but at the window. It was soft, deliberate. I froze, my blood turning cold. My first thought was that it was an animal, but animals don't knock. I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The curtains were drawn. I couldn't see outside. Another knock. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the window. My fingers trembled as I reached for the curtain. Then silence. I yanked the curtain open. Nothing. Just darkness and the distorted reflection of my own terrified face. I didn't sleep that night. Morning came, bringing a false sense of safety. Sunlight poured through the trees, and the fear of the night before felt almost irrational. Almost. I decided to take another walk to clear my head. As I stepped onto the trail leading away from the cabin, I noticed something that made my breath catch. More footprints. This time, they weren't just circling the cabin. They led into the woods. Someone had been standing out here, watching. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to town. But something inside me needed to know. I followed the footprints. They led me deep into the forest, off the main path, through thick brush and tangled roots. After about 15 minutes, I reached a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A campsite, or what was left of one. There was a small fire pit, long cold, and a pile of food wrappers scattered around. A sleeping bag lay crumpled beneath a tree, filthy and torn. A notebook sat on a rock, its pages curling from moisture. I picked it up, my hands shaking. Inside, I found pages filled with erratic handwriting. One sentence repeated over and over. "Don't let him see you. Don't let him see you. Don't let him see you." The final page had only 2 words, written in large, dark strokes. "He knows." A twig snapped behind me. I turned, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. The forest was silent. I ran. I packed my bags, but night fell before I could leave. The rain had turned the dirt road into thick mud, and my car's tires were nearly buried in it. I had no choice but to wait until morning. I locked the doors. I shut the curtains. I kept the fireplace poker by my side. Then, just past midnight, a knock. Not at the window this time, at the door. I didn't move. Another knock. Then, a voice. "Let me in." It was quiet, almost a whisper. I stayed completely still. "Let me in," the voice repeated. I held my breath. My grip on the poker tightened. Then silence. I stayed awake the entire night, listening to every sound, every creak, every shift of the wind. I never heard footsteps, but in the morning, when I finally built up the courage to step outside, the footprints were back, leading from the door. I didn't waste time. As soon as the sun was up, I threw my bags into the car and floored it. The road was a nightmare, thick mud, deep ruts, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. When I reached town, I went straight to the rental agency. I told them everything: the logbook, the footprints, the knocks. The woman behind the desk listened quietly. When I finished, she took a deep breath. "You're not the first," she said.
Ist er hier?
"What do you mean?" She hesitated, then pulled out an old file. Inside were printed emails, complaints from previous renters. They all described the same thing: footsteps, knocks, the logbook, but no one had ever seen who or what was out there. I left immediately. I don't know who was watching me that week, and I don't want to know. I needed a break from the city. The constant noise, the people, the overwhelming weight of my job. I was drained. So, I booked a week-long stay in a remote cabin deep in the woods. No cell service, no internet, just me and nature. Exactly what I needed. The listing described it as a cozy getaway with a rustic charm. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and miles of dense forest in every direction. The owner's only rule? Do not open the locked room. That should have been a red flag. I arrived late in the afternoon, the drive taking longer than expected. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow and overgrown, tree branches scraping against my car as I navigated the winding path. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small, a little worn, but welcoming. There was a fire pit outside, a stack of chopped wood against the porch, and a single rocking chair swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and dust. The furniture was old but well-maintained. A couch, a small kitchen, a wooden dining table. There were 2 doors, one leading to the bedroom and another with a heavy metal padlock on it. The locked room. The note on the kitchen counter from the owner welcomed me, reminding me again, "Storage room is locked. Do not attempt to open it." I wasn't planning to. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking, making a quick dinner, and enjoying the quiet. By nightfall, the temperature dropped, and I lit a fire in the fireplace. The warmth spreading through the small space. Felt peaceful, safe. I woke to a sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping. Lying in bed, I held my breath, listening. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling leaves outside, but it was there, coming from inside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dimly lit by the first light of dawn creeping through the curtains. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. Then it came again. A slow, deliberate knock. From the locked door. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was impossible. No one else was here. The cabin had been empty when I arrived. I had locked the front door. Holding my breath, I slid out of bed, stepping as lightly as possible across the wooden floor. The knocking had stopped, but now I was close enough to hear something else. Shuffling. Something or someone was moving inside that room. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. Then, a quiet cough. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind raced. It had to be an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a rat stuck inside. There was no way another person was in there. I considered leaving, but the drive back to town was at least 2 hours through rough terrain. Instead, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe the old wood was settling, or maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. Still, I avoided that side of the cabin for the rest of the day. That night, the noises started again. I had been reading by the fire when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching against wood. It was coming from inside the locked room. I turned off the lamp and held my breath. The sound continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging against the door. I grabbed the flashlight and hesitantly approached. "Hello," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, a faint whisper from the other side. A voice, weak, hoarse. "Help me." The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. My stomach twisted. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Someone was inside. I forced myself to step closer, pressing my palm against the cool wood of the door. "Who's in there?" I asked, my voice shaking. Silence again. I waited, breathless, my ears straining, and then, thud, a single heavy thump against the door, like something hitting it from the other side. I ran. I grabbed my keys, yanked open the front door, and sprinted to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, speeding down the dark dirt road without looking back. I drove straight to the nearest town, found a motel, and locked myself inside the room for the night. The next morning, I called the cabin owner. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. Frustrated, I drove to the nearest sheriff's station. I told them everything, the noises, the voice, the locked room. First, they looked at me like I was crazy. Then, one of the officers asked for the cabin's address. When I gave it to him, his expression changed. He exchanged a look with the other deputies before saying, "Wait here." 10 minutes later, they sent 2 officers to check the cabin. I followed. When we arrived, everything looked the same. The front door was locked. The firewood was undisturbed. But when the officers broke open the locked room, what we found made my blood run cold. A man, thin, pale, eyes sunken deep into his skull. He was curled in the corner, his wrists raw and bleeding from where they had been bound. The room stank of sweat and urine. The air was stale, suffocating. He was alive, but barely. The officers called for paramedics, and as they pulled him out, he muttered something in a weak, rasping voice. He said he wouldn't be gone long. Later, the police found out the truth. The cabin's owner, a man named Richard Lawson, had been keeping him prisoner for months. The victim had been abducted from a nearby town, held captive in that tiny, suffocating space. The only reason he was still alive was that I had come. I had heard him, and I had left him behind. The thought still haunts me. I could have saved him sooner. I could have opened that door. I could have listened to my instincts, but I didn't, and that's a mistake I'll never forget. I had always enjoyed renting remote cabins, getting away from the city noise, and escaping into nature. It wasn't about adventure for me. I wasn't the type to hike miles into the wilderness or live off the land. I just liked the quiet. A small fire, a good book, and the absence of other people. This time was no different. I had booked a small, single-bedroom cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The pictures had shown a rustic but well-maintained place, perched on the edge of a dense pine forest. It had a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and, most importantly, no neighbors for miles. It was perfect. I arrived in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low behind the trees. The drive had been long, and my only stop for supplies had been at a tiny general store about an hour away. When I pulled up, I immediately noticed how isolated the place really was. The road ended at the cabin, and beyond it, nothing but endless forest. I stepped out of my car and inhaled the cool air. It was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the rustling of branches and the occasional bird call. No distant traffic, no people, just stillness. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the cabin door. The inside was cozy. Wooden walls, a thick rug, and a large stone fireplace in the center of the living room. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The kitchen was small but functional, with a well-stocked pantry left by the owner. I set my bags down, lit a fire, and let myself settle in. By the time darkness fully set in, the cabin felt like its own little world. The fire crackled, casting long shadows along the walls. Outside, the night was pitch black, the trees swaying in the wind. I had no cell service, but that was expected. I had brought books and a journal, so I spent most of the evening reading by the fire. Occasionally, I would glance out the large front window, seeing nothing but darkness beyond. There were no streetlights, no distant cabin lights, just the endless void of the forest. At around midnight, I decided to turn in. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and crawled into bed. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear it whispering through the trees. I was exhausted from the long drive, so I drifted off almost immediately. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe just the silence itself. But something pulled me from sleep, and when I opened my eyes, I felt alert. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the room. I sat up in bed, listening. Outside, the wind had stopped. The air felt heavy, thick with stillness. Then, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the room. In that brief moment of brightness, my eyes instinctively flicked to the large front window, and I saw it. A shape, a silhouette standing just outside, staring in. The flash ended, plunging the room back into darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, straining my ears, waiting for any sound. Footsteps, breathing, movement. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like minutes, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen. Person, out here in the middle of nowhere, no car, no reason to be here. Another flash of lightning. The figure was gone. I slowly slid out of bed, moving carefully toward the window. My bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor. My fingers trembled as I reached for the curtain. I pulled it aside just a fraction, just enough to peek out. The darkness was absolute. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. Beyond it, nothing but the inky black of the forest. I waited, scanning the tree line, the porch, the driveway. No movement, but I knew what I had seen. I barely slept after that. Every sound made me jump. Every shift in the wind sent chills down my spine. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight. The fear that had gripped me in the night felt almost foolish now. I stepped outside, the cold air shocking me fully awake. The ground was damp from the night storm, the scent of wet earth strong in the air. I walked toward the window where I had seen the figure. There was nothing, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I cooked breakfast, chopped some wood, even read for a while. But I kept glancing at the window, checking the tree line, listening for anything unusual. By evening, I had almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the light. Maybe a tree's shadow had caught my eye at the wrong moment. Maybe. That night, I built the fire higher. I kept every light in the cabin on. I wasn't gonna let my mind play tricks on me again. I stayed up later than usual, reading, keeping myself distracted. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. Nothing. No figures in the window, no strange sounds outside. Relieved, I finally let myself relax. That was when I saw it. A single muddy handprint on the glass, right where I had been looking out the night before. My stomach dropped. The print was fresh, the streaks of dirt still wet. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching me. I stood frozen, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something. But what? Run? Call for help? There was no one out here. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my grip tight. Slowly, I approached the door, pressing my ear against it. The world outside was silent. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then, from the darkness, a soft creak. The sound of wood shifting. A single step on the porch. I barely breathed. Another step. They were still here. I clenched the poker tighter, my heart slamming against my ribs. I thought about running for my car, but the keys were in the kitchen. The windows were locked, but the cabin was old. Could they be pried open? The steps stopped. Silence. I stood there, muscles tense, listening for anything. Then, softly, deliberately, 3 slow taps against the window. Top, top, top. My stomach twisted. They knew I was inside. They were toying with me. I couldn't stay here. In one motion, I lunged for my keys, grabbed my jacket, and sprinted for the door. I yanked it open and ran, not stopping to look back. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never went back. The owner messaged me a few days later, asking why I had left so suddenly. I told him I had an emergency. I didn't mention the figure in the window, the handprint, the tapping, but he did. He said I had left the front door wide open. The fire had burned out, and in the morning when he went to check on the cabin, there were footprints leading from the woods to the window and back again.